Robert Baratheon is one of the most beloved characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. Mainly due to the fact that he's hilarious, the actor portraying him is incredibly charismatic, and his stories of glory and sheer badassery are, for many, more than enough to generate a ton of love for this character. And I can't stand him. And for some of you who are wondering why I'm covering this character again, to put it simply, my previous video about Robert isn't up to standard, and regardless, I'm keeping my promise of going back and having a more nuanced discussion about characters that I didn't like or don't like for the sake of transparency. And a little spoiler for the future of this video, even with a more sympathetic take and perspective, I still can't stand Robert Baratheon. To begin this analysis, it's first important to understand where Robert Baratheon comes from and how his early life possibly informed the decisions that he would make as an adult. Robert Baratheon was born in 262 AC, the first son of Steffon Baratheon and Cassana Estermont, Lord and Lady of Storm's End. He was just a year old when his brother Stannis was born, and then their youngest brother Renly would come along much later. As a child, Robert was taken to court with Stannis, where they saw Tywin Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne as Hand of the King. Even then, Robert showed his larger-than-life personality by flying his falcon Thunderclap and mocking Stannis' weaker bird, Proudwing. He grew up fostered in the Vale under Lord Jon Arryn, alongside Eddard Stark, forming bonds that would define him for the rest of his life. Jon, having no children of his own, became a father figure to both boys. Robert spent his youth between Storm's End and the Eyrie, even being knighted along the way, even though he would famously lose a tilt to Barristan Selmy at a tourney. Unfortunately, however, tragedy struck in 278 AC when his father and mother drowned in Shipbreaker Bay. Their ship destroyed into thousands of pieces as Robert and Stannis watched helplessly from the shore. With Steffon's death, Robert inherited Storm's End, stepping into his role as Lord of the Stormlands at just 16 years old. And even though his early life isn't that expansive in terms of what we know, there is enough here to assume much about what George is trying to say regarding the character of Robert Baratheon. First of all, it's important to note the way in which George toys with the concepts of nature and nurture in his universe. Do people become who they are because of the way that they are raised, or is it genetic? Are they who they're meant to be from the time of birth? And I believe Robert Baratheon, like many other characters, while a combination of both, has a lot of this innate negativity that he would later show in life, even as a child. For example, Robert is most definitely a bully later on in life. A great example of this is the way he slights his brother Stannis, feels Lyanna Stark is just his by right, and beats and sexually abuses Cersei because again he just feels he can. And these toxic ideals are prevalent when he is a child, based off of the way that he treats his brother Stannis. And while I will concede that it is remotely normal for brothers to mess around and compete with one another, the seemingly one-sided mockery of Stannis Baratheon is evident of Robert having an abusive personality even as a child. But where this gets very interesting in regards to nature versus nurture is Ned Stark. Ned is raised alongside Robert Baratheon at Jon Arryn's side, and yet they ended up two entirely different people. This to me proves that George R. R. Martin is trying to say that while an environment is definitely crucial to the development of the child, there are just some things genetically that some people are more accustomed to than others. Studies in the real world support this theory as well. But with that being said, I do believe that Robert Baratheon, witnessing the death of his parents and becoming the man of the house at 16, played a crucial role in turning what once was a decent boy with some issues into the monster that we are presented with in the main series. 16 years old is a tough time for a young man. It's a time where confusion is at an all-time high, and you have to start making decisions for what kind of man you want to be for the rest of your life. And something that can really derail and affect this necessary time for growth is grief. Now, I want to preface what I'm about to say that yes, in this world, many people lose their parents at a young age, but just because death at a young age is more normalized doesn't mean the grief doesn't hit just as hard. I believe that Robert Baratheon, after witnessing the tragic death of his parents at 16 years old, did what anyone would do in that moment: cope. And coping with grief is something that everybody does differently. Some people grieve like Stannis, becoming very quiet and hard, not showing much emotion, and closing in on themselves, wearing this hard exterior as if it's armor to mask their pain. While Robert masks his grief with outlandish and impulsive desires. In dealing with the loss of his parents, Robert turned to partying, he turned to alcohol, he turned to women, and he turned to war. I firmly believe that Robert Baratheon became the man that he would become for the rest of his life due to the way he lived his life in these early years after his parents died. In fact, the birth of Maya Stone, who is Robert's oldest bastard daughter, occurred at the end of 279 AC, roughly a year after the death of Robert's parents. So it makes sense that in the immediate time after the death of his parents, Robert Baratheon, in his weakness, looked to shield his grief with the flesh of women, which led to Maya Stone. And I want you to keep this idea in mind as we progress throughout this video. Robert Baratheon's entire existence can be summed up to a young man never learning or caring to learn about how to properly process grief. Which brings us to one of the most important events in the history of Westeros, Robert's Rebellion. In 282 AC, Robert launched Robert's Rebellion in order to take back the woman that he loved, Lyanna Stark. And before we get into the actual rebellion, it's important to talk about this quote-unquote love that Robert felt for Lyanna in the first place. I don't believe that Robert ever actually truly loved Lyanna. I believe what he did do was love the idea of claiming something desirable as his own. From the time that Robert was a child, making fun of Stannis, there is this desire that he has to be seen, to be the center of attention, to be loved, and to be the strongest around. Lyanna Stark was a rare fruit in the Song of Ice and Fire world, a beautiful woman with a big personality that had some of the most legendary lords and knights drooling over her. Robert, being the man that he is, recognized this and viewed her as something he could claim and overcome. He fell in love with the sense of self that she could offer him, not with the actual person that is Lyanna Stark. A great parallel to this is how Cersei views her sexual partners. Cersei views and treats the men in her life more like toys to make herself feel better about herself. Robert is much the same. But Rhaegar, taking that chance from him, enraged him, and the fact that it was specifically Rhaegar that did this triggered a trauma response that Robert had had deep down inside of him for years. It's important to note how Robert's parents actually died. Robert's father was sent on a mission by King Aerys II Targaryen to travel to Volantis to find a bride for Robert's cousin, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. So Robert's parents died specifically because they were sent on a mission to find a wife for Rhaegar. And even though this isn't confirmed, I would bet a lot on the idea that Robert held a lot of animosity for Rhaegar and Aerys for playing a massive role in the death of his parents. This anger that he definitely already had was enhanced by the fact that Rhaegar, the very person who caused the death of his parents, was the one who took the person Robert wanted to be with. Put yourself in Robert's shoes for a second. Imagine your parents died trying to find a wife for someone you know, and then in the future, that very guy takes the girl you want to be his wife. I imagine Robert Baratheon was thinking, so my parents died for nothing since you ended up finding someone on your own anyways, and that person just had to be the girl I want to be with? Of course. It makes perfect sense that Robert would be pissed, and for what it's worth, the Mad King did have to go. But it's also important to understand that while Aerys did need to go, launching a rebellion that would result in the death of tens of thousands of people because of a singular person's vendetta is, in my opinion, a morally corrupt decision to make. And while this is an issue that everyone in the realm falls victimizer to, they all still have agency in their own decisions. Just imagine the amount of broken men that Robert created, primarily because he was never able to properly cope with the death and tragedy of his parents. So Robert launches his rebellion, kills Rhaegar, overthrows the Mad King, and you know all the rest. Robert takes the throne with what he truly loved more than anything: fire and blood. And what's very interesting to note about Robert's rebellion is Robert loved it. While Ned Stark looks back at that time in his life as dark days, days that infect his sleep and haunt every waking moment of his life, Robert looks back at them and longs for them. In A Game of Thrones, he speaks proudly of the man that he was. He speaks proudly of the men that he killed, of the blood that he spilled, of the woman that he slept with. The fame, the glory, the attention, the fighting made Robert Baratheon feel alive. It was a time where he was allowed and encouraged to be himself, to let out all of his pain, grief, and desire onto the world. And this made him one hell of a warrior. But it also made him an awful king and a worse man. After the rebellion, there really wasn't much war to be fought, and Robert having to come to terms with the fact that one of the ways he coped with his grief and issues, that being conflict, was no longer available. And understanding this, he was faced with two choices. Option 1, grow up, be the king that needed to be, accept what has happened, and try and change for the better. Or Option 2, double down, give in to your bad habits, and drown yourself in women and alcohol till you eventually die an early death. And Robert chose the second option. And just to note, this is where many of my sympathies for Robert Baratheon are going to end, due to the fact that after Robert's rebellion, he is a genuine monster of a man. Instead of ruling the realm and trying to mend the wounds that scarred the realm, he instead leveraged his position to just obtain more flesh and wine. Robert, due to the fact that he still needed a toxic outlet for his issues, became a gluttonous and harmful individual, all for temporary satisfaction, while the realm was left aside to rot. And it is during his near 20 years of passive, gluttonous rule that Robert truly succumbs to the worst parts of himself, with one of his most abhorrent acts being the way he sexually abused Cersei and treats women as a whole. Throughout primarily A Feast for Crows, we get an insight to this and who he was through Cersei. For example, here's a quote for when Cersei has a relation with a woman regarding Robert Baratheon. But it was no good. She could not feel it. Whatever Robert felt on the nights he took her, there was no pleasure in it. Not for her. Robert would have loved you for an hour. Once he spent himself inside you, he would have been hard-pressed to recall your name. In the same chapter, she notes this: "Do as you please, but you may find that the city is not a healthy place for a growing girl." The bruise those words had won her had been hard to hide from Jaime, but they heard no more about the bastard girl, showing that while Robert acted somewhat reasonable in public, behind closed doors, he wasn't against using physical violence against Cersei in order to take control over her. And to make matters worse, Robert's abuse of Cersei didn't just stop at this. It went further and became much more disgusting. For example, in Cersei 7, she remembers this about Robert. In time, the assaults did grow less frequent. During the first year, he took her at least once a fortnight. By the end, it was not even once a year. He never stopped completely, though. Sooner or later, there'd always come a night when he would drink too much and want to claim his rights. What shamed him in the light of the day gave him pleasure in the darkness. And to make matters even worse, somehow Robert, being the coward that he is, couldn't even look Cersei in the eyes after he would do such actions and take accountability for what he's done. In the same chapter, she says this: "For Robert, those nights never happened. Come morning, he remembered nothing, or so he would have her believe. Once during the first year of their marriage, Cersei had voiced her displeasure the next day. 'You hurt me,' she complained. He had the grace to look ashamed. 'It was not me, my lady,' he said in a sulky, sullen tone, like a child caught stealing apple cakes from the kitchen. 'It was the wine. I drank too much wine.' To wash down his admission, he reached for a horn of ale. As he raised it to his mouth, she smashed her own horn in his face so hard she chipped a tooth." Years later at a feast, she heard him telling a serving wench how he'd cracked the tooth in a melee. Well, our marriage was like a melee, she reflected, so he did not lie. The rest had all been lies, though. He did remember what he did to her that night. She was convinced of that. She could see it in his eyes. He only pretended to forget. It was easier to do that than to face his shame. Deep down, Robert Baratheon was a coward. In time, the assaults did grow less frequent, so iron hung on his shame in daylight, while he sought his pleasure in darkness. Beyond just his abuse of Cersei, however, and other women sexually, there's also the fact that he actively supported the hunting and total annihilation of the Targaryens, even the children. The obvious atrocity of this being the way in which he calls for the death of Daenerys and Viserys, leaving them on the run and scarring them for life. But the less obvious one is he knew what happened to Elia Martell and her children, and did nothing to punish the men who committed such an atrocity. Beyond that, Robert, through spending his time drinking and lusting, let the realm rot under uncertain rulers, which directly leads the realm to being broke. It leads to unrest, it leads to starvation, and it leads to murder among the small folk. All of the terrible lives that people live in the Seven Kingdoms occur either directly or indirectly due to the fact that Robert was a terrible king and a terrible person. All of these points about Robert's character is where much of my animosity for him comes from. I can sympathize with someone who's been through a fair share of tragedy, but at the same time, for me, it gets to a point where your deplorable actions cannot be justified by the trauma you've went through. As people, I believe we all have the ability to change. We all have the ability to become better and give up the worst parts of ourselves. Robert Baratheon was offered this choice many times. Throughout his life, he was constantly surrounded by people who were willing to love and help him through his pain and sorrow. People like Ned and Jon and even Cersei for a time were all willing to work with him to make a better realm. But his anger, his lust, his desire to drown himself in his sorrow and in his grief overpowered any humanity that the man might have once had. And it is very important to understand that Robert Baratheon knew this. There is this misconception that people have about Robert that he was some sort of drunken idiot that never had any idea how to rule in the first place, and that's simply not true. Robert was a very, very smart man. He was raised well by Jon Arryn and was very aware of what it took to be a good leader. He just simply didn't care, because to him it wasn't enjoyable. Being a good king meant his life would be boring, and the wild, crazy Robert who needed blood, flesh, and wine just to exist made the conscious decision to choose the latter. And I know this because in his final moments while talking to his friend Ned, there is some semblance of remorse and clarity in his words. On his deathbed, he admits to some of his flaws as a character, and admits that in some ways he was wrong all along, but unfortunately it was too little too late. He had let the realm rot for too long, and the other dominoes were already beginning to fall by the time he realized he was the first one to tip. So to make a long story short, the main reason that I cannot stand Robert Baratheon, even though I do sympathize with the beginning of his story, is Robert is an inherently self-destructive character that actively chooses to live a disgusting and brutal life that negatively affects anyone and everyone, mainly due to the fact that he gets a semblance of satisfaction from it for half a second. Robert Baratheon is everything a young man should aspire not to be. A beast that gives into his worst desires until it eventually kills him and the realm with him.